"Who did you call?" the dying man demanded, terrified. He was bleeding in the gutter, but when Emma said she dialed the emergency number in his wallet, his face went totally pale. Because that number didn't go to the cops. It went to his father, a merciless mafia kingpin. Before the black SUVs rolled in, he begs her to lie to the scariest man in the city. Could you keep a secret while surrounded by silent mobsters in a dark alley?
Let's start the broadcast right here. You and I walking the damp pavement of a city that never sleeps. Picture Emma. The phone pressed to her ear, streetlights flickering. She tells the stranger, "Your son is dying in an alley on 5th Street. I do not know who you are, but this number says emergency." 3 seconds of suffocating silence follow. It is not the silence of shock, but of a man trained to swallow tragedy whole. Then, a voice that makes her blood run cold. "Do not call the police. Do not move him. Do not tell a single soul." She should have hung up right then, but she did not. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe and tell me what city you are listening from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go. Emma lived by a strict rule about strangers in dark alleys. She never stopped for them. Not because she lacked a heart. In fact, she had spent her whole life giving too much, pouring grace into empty cups that never loved her back. But 12 years, working the late shift at a diner, teaches you things a textbook cannot. She knew exactly how to spot the difference between a person who just needed a hand and a situation that would swallow her alive. She knew it in her bones. But tonight, the universe had other plans. When she saw him lying there, face pressed into the wet asphalt, one arm reaching out, as if trying to grab onto a second chance he ran out of time for, her golden rule shattered into pieces. It was the suit that made her freeze, dark, tailored, whispering of a kind of wealth that did not belong in this bruised and broken zip code. Emma knew old money when she saw it, even when it was ruined by the rain. She crept closer. Her shift had ended 11 minutes ago. She had $16 in tip money folded in her apron and leftover soup waiting at home. Suddenly, the ordinary life she wanted to get back to did not matter at all. "Hey, can you hear me?" she called out to the shadow. Nothing. She knelt down, her knees soaking up the cold puddle, and pressed 2 trembling fingers to his neck. It was exactly what her mother taught her after her own father's heart attack. The exact moment Emma first learned what true, terrifying helplessness felt like. A pulse. It was faint, stumbling like a man walking in the dark, but it was there. "Okay," she whispered into the mist, "you are still here." She rolled him onto his side, and that is when she saw the truth. Thick, dark blood spreading from somewhere beneath his expensive jacket, turning his white shirt into a tragedy. This was no drunken stumble. This was not a simple mistake. A human being had done this to him, deliberately and with brutal intention. "I need to make a call," she muttered to the empty air. She pulled out her phone, dialing the first 2 digits of emergency services. But something made her stop. Not a logical thought. It was that deep, primal instinct wired into our bones, warning us when a predator is nearby. Here is where you and I have to pause and look at the scene through her eyes. Emma stared at the blood. She looked around the alley. It was entirely deserted, but not just empty. It felt completely hollowed out, as if someone had purposefully cleared the stage for a nightmare. She slipped her phone away. Instead, her shaking hands reached into his jacket, desperate for a name, a clue, anything to explain what kind of hell this man was caught in. She pulled out a heavy wallet and found his license. Ethan Sullivan, 34 years old. An address in a neighborhood where the doorman wore suits finer than anything Emma had ever touched. And then a small, heavy piece of cardstock slipped out, landing right in the wet grime between her knees. There was no company name on it, no logo, just a single phone number embossed in gold ink, catching the faint glow of the street lamp like a warning sign. Beneath it, 4 tiny, pristine words for emergencies only call. Emma stared at the bleeding man. She picked up the card, her fingers trembling against the stiff paper, and dialed. It rang exactly twice. Who is this? The voice on the other end did not ask a question. It was a cold demand, stripped of all humanity. It sounded like a judge rendering a verdict before she even had a chance to speak. "My name is Emma Turner," she answered, finding a strange strength in her chest. "I work at Murphy's Diner on 5th. I found a man unconscious in the alley right behind the building. His name is Ethan Sullivan," she continued, trying to hold the line steady. "It is on his license. I found this number in his wallet, and he is bleeding pretty badly, and she caught herself, swallowing the panic. "I needed someone to know." The pause that followed was sharp and surgical. "How long ago did you find him?" the voice demanded. 3, maybe 4 minutes ago," Emma replied. "How severe is the bleeding?" She pressed her hand against his side, feeling the terrible heat of it, fighting off a wave of sheer terror. "It is significant," she told him. "He needs a hospital." "He will not be going to a hospital," the voice commanded, heavy and final, as a vault door slamming shut. "You will not move him, and you will not speak to a single soul. Listen to me, because this is where the life lesson hides in the shadows. You learn a lot about a man by what he chooses to conceal. Strangers do not tell you to avoid the authorities, unless the authorities are the very thing they are running from. They do not have private crews ready to move at 3 in the morning, unless their entire life is a war zone." Every instinct Emma possessed was screaming at her to run. "Am I clear, Miss Turner?" the voice asked. "Yes," she breathed out, "you are clear." And then came the detail that would haunt her for years to come. He did not hang up the phone. He left the connection completely open. He said absolutely nothing. I just waited, standing guard over the silence like a ghost watching over a grave. It was as if this man had spent an entire lifetime perfecting the art of weaponized silence. Emma knelt on the freezing pavement, listening to the rhythmic breathing of a phantom on the line, keeping her hand pressed tight against Ethan's wound. And then, at exactly 1 minute and 40 seconds, Ethan jolted awake. He did not stir slowly. He surfaced violently, instantly alert. There was no grogginess, no confusion. He woke up like a soldier who knew sleep was a luxury he could not afford. His eyes darted across the dark alley before locking onto Emma with an intensity that physically stole her breath. "Do not move," she told him, her voice low and steady. "You are badly hurt. Help is on the way." "Who?" he gasped, his voice breaking in the dark. He forced himself to swallow, choking down the pain. "Who did you call?" he demanded. "The number on your card," she whispered. The transformation in Ethan was immediate and terrifying. Any lingering trace of shock vanished, replaced by an emotion Emma could barely comprehend. It was pure dread mixed with total resignation, the look of a man who just realized his worst nightmare had finally found him. His hand shot up, his fingers clamping around her wrist like a steel trap. "How long ago?" he rasped. 2 minutes, she said. "Did he answer himself or did someone else?" "He answered himself," Emma replied. Ethan closed his eyes, his jaw locking tight. He was making peace with his fate, the way you accept a tragedy you always knew was coming. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay, listen to me very carefully," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am listening," Emma replied. "In about 2 minutes a line of cars is going to pull into this alley. You are going to see men you have never seen before, and they are going to do things that will deeply frighten you." He forced his heavy eyes open, staring right into her soul. "You cannot look frightened. Do you understand me?" "Who are these people?" she asked. "Can you do it? Yes or no?" Emma held his stare. 12 years of dealing with broken souls, angry drunks, and the midnight chaos of the city had given her a profound sense of armor. She knew how to bury her terror deep down. "Yes," she told him. He gave a slow nod. Then he offered a quiet, desperate plea. "I am so sorry you were the one who had to find me," he whispered. She never even got the chance to reply, because the headlights swept across the damp brick walls. 3 heavy, black vehicles with no license plates rolled into the alleyway. They moved with a chilling, practiced rhythm, sliding into formation like wolves circling their prey. Large, quiet men stepped out into the rain. They did not waste a single breath or a single movement. They swarmed Ethan, completely ignoring Emma, communicating in sharp gestures and silent glances that she could not decipher. Finally, one of the men turned his dead, empty eyes toward her. His face was entirely devoid of any human emotion. "Step back," he ordered her, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Emma backed slowly away as the 4th car pulled up. This one was different, heavier, casting a long shadow. The man who stepped out possessed a quiet gravity that made the entire world feel like it revolved around his grief. He was older, silver hair catching the rain, wearing a long coat thrown hastily over his clothes. His eyes locked onto his bleeding son and nothing else. And right there, just for a fraction of a second, before his cold armor slid back into place, you and I could see it. The raw, stripped agony of a father staring at the brutal consequences of his own violent life. Then Vincent Sullivan locked away the pain, walked to his boy, and laid a trembling hand against his face, a heartbreaking gesture Emma instinctively turned away from. Doubt and fear, they're the silent language of a stranger's gaze, the kind that can make a person vanish into themselves. "I'm fine," Ethan said, but his eyes told a different story. "You and I both know the truth." Vincent's presence dominated the alley, the way he moved, every step a clear intent. He found Emma as if predestined. She'd faced down the drunk and angry at Murphy's, but the air around Vincent held a different kind of weight. "You are the woman who called," he stated, and knew her name. How could he not? It had been on the phone. Vincent Sullivan. He studied her, with the intensity you'd reserve for a binding agreement, the subtle nuances, the potential flaws. She stood her ground, recalling Ethan's words, drawing strength from that small defiance. "Tell me what he said when he woke up," he demanded. The question she'd anticipated, like a storm front, looming. "You and I, we've all faced moments that demand a decision." What kind of person would she be? "He asked if I was okay," she said. Confusion clouded his face. "I've known that kind of moment, the split-second choice." Vincent held her gaze, a lifetime's worth of unspoken truths hanging heavy. "Is that all?" he asked, as if weighing her worth with the smallest of phrases. "That's all." Silence stretched, and in that void a subtle shift occurred. Not warmth, but an acknowledgement. You and I have seen it, that glimmer of recognition from one who's heard 1,000 lies. It's that moment when they realize, maybe, they've heard the truth. "My son lives because you acted," Vincent said, his voice flat. He took a moment. "That's something I don't forget." "I didn't do it to be remembered," Emma replied, the truth slipping out. The raw, unfiltered honesty. A flicker of something, almost nothing. Crossed Vincent's face, a hint of understanding, for just a moment, and the world shifted for just a moment. "No, I don't think you did." He turned, speaking in low, terse phrases. The rescue mission, a ballet of efficiency. Everything happened quickly. The ambulance, the car, it was all a blur, Emma observed, holding her face still. "Go home, Miss Turner. Someone will be in touch." Then, the lesson of the day as she was on her way to her car, run and the world will devour you. Walk and it might just give you a chance. She walked the 6 blocks home, her legs leaden, her mind racing, the silence heavy and full. She climbed the stairs, unlocked the door, and sank onto the couch. The microwave clock read 2:49 a.m., 32 minutes, and she felt a decade older. You and I understand that feeling of being suspended. The phone buzzed, an unknown number, and her heart hammered. Vincent's voice, a call in the dead of night. I wanted to ensure you arrived home safely. This wasn't something to ignore. The chill crept in, a slow, deliberate freeze, a lesson for the day. How did you know I was home? A brief pause. The timing suggested it, the man said. She looked at the window, the empty street. I'm home, she said. Good. Another pause. My son wants to thank you. I hope you'll allow that. Everything in her screamed no. Of course, she heard herself say. Good. Another pause, like something was about to be dropped inside that silence. Sometimes in life we have no real choice in the matter. Miss Turner, one more thing, she was told. What you told me about Ethan, I chose to believe you. Do you understand the difference? This was not an invitation, but a command, a price to be paid. She understood. The choice had been made, the debt incurred. It felt like all of this was not about her. He expected her to comply the unspoken rules of this new world. She responded, I understand. You and I both know about these crossroads. Good night, Miss Turner. Good night, Mr. Sullivan. The quiet after the call, a heavy blanket of unspoken consequence. The coffee went cold. Soup forgotten, outside the city, hummed its ordinary tune. She looked at her hands, the hands that felt for a pulse, the hands that clutched a business card, the hands that held a dying man's side. She had made peace with being small, invisible, unremarkable, safe. And now, at 3 a.m., she understood. That peace was over. The lesson for the day, some things you can never go back to. The question that haunted her, the one that wouldn't let her sleep, wasn't, what have I done? But, what happens next? The terrifying, unavoidable truth. She was about to find out. The next morning, back to work. What else could she do? Call in sick, replay the phone call. Murphy's Diner at 6:45 a.m., burnt coffee, the hope that only exists before 7 when anything seems possible. You and I, we all go back to the world as it is as we left it. She filled the coffee station and didn't think about Vincent Sullivan. She didn't think about the alley. She focused on the order, the cook. She lasted until 9:17 a.m. The black car appeared. Right outside the window, it didn't park. It stopped, idling, windows dark. Even as her nerves went on high alert. Hun, you're overflowing my cup, Mr. Delgado said. Sometimes the universe conspires to make a point. And the lesson is simple. It is what it is. She told herself it meant nothing, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. At 11:40, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stepped into the back and answered. A voice, but not Vincent's. Warm, carefully constructed. My name is Daniel. I work for the Sullivan family. Mr. Sullivan asked me to confirm a time for this afternoon. The world shifts. I work until 3, Emma said. A lesson of the day. Never think you are in control. A car will come to the diner at Murphy's. Still stared at the phone. We'll see you at 3, Miss Turner. Emma in the back hallway of Murphy's is to take one step. Sometimes, the only way to move forward is to take one step. She was not patriotic of life, refilled the napkin holders. When the bell, above the door, chimed, a man walked in. You and I both know, life can change in an instant. The man who walked through the door, the one she'd been expecting the doorway, assessing. He wasn't Ethan. This was a man of business, sharp eyes, a tailored suit. Daniel, you and I both know that look. The one that says, there's no turning thing. The lesson for the day. You can't always choose your path. It wasn't just the tailored suit that made the diner air grow heavy. It was the way he moved, like the ground itself would gladly part for his footsteps. His dark eyes scanned the booths, locking onto Emma with a frightening certainty. This wasn't the man bleeding out in the rain. This was Ethan Sullivan, terrifyingly whole. He told her he was early, hoping it was all right. Funny thing about power, isn't it? The ones who truly hold it never have to raise their voice. We often judge a book by its frayed cover, but sometimes survival means recognizing the quiet danger walking through your front door. Emma stood there, acutely aware of her own reality. The smell of stale coffee clinging to her apron, a stubborn grease stain marking her left sleeve. She was in absolutely no condition to face a ghost who had suddenly put on a $1,000 suit. "Give me 5 minutes," she managed, turning away before he could grant permission. She told her manager she had a family emergency, her voice remarkably steady as she stripped off the apron. "We all build these little armors, don't we? When life catches you unprepared, the bravest thing you can do is wash your face, breathe, and buy yourself a moment to remember who you are." Alone in the cramped employee bathroom, she stared into the cracked glass for 10 seconds. "You are fine," she whispered, though both she and the reflection knew it was a desperate lie. When she finally walked out, Ethan did something unexpected. He stood up from his stool. It was an old-fashioned courtesy that landed square in her chest, rearranging pieces she hadn't known were out of place. He told her he came because he wanted to, not because he had to. "You know, we spend so much energy running from our fears. But sometimes the most profound growth happens when we simply force ourselves to walk straight back out into the room." She sank onto the stool beside him. Standing felt like too much of a performance, and her aching feet had entirely run out of patience for theater. She asked about his wounds, the cracked ribs, the 22 stitches. He brushed it off, saying it looked worse than it was. "It looked like you were dying," she replied softly. A shadow crossed his face. He knew exactly what it looked like, and that was why he was here. She had saved his life and lied to his terrifying father, all within half an hour. Look, life rarely gives us a warning before it tests our character. The truest measure of who we are is what we do when the pressure is unbearable. The word hung heavy over the laminated menus between them. Lied. He didn't soften it with gentle phrasing. Emma bristled breast, defending herself. She hadn't lied exactly, just withheld the full truth. But Ethan knew the rules of his dark world. Omission and deception were twin brothers. He told her he wasn't there to demand answers. He had seen the exact moment in the alley when she weighed the risks and chose to protect him. She didn't panic. She calculated. There is a quiet beauty in trusting your own instincts. Sometimes, the most pivotal moments of our lives are decided in a single heartbeat, relying on a deeply buried strength we never knew we had. Emma thought about her 12 years of grinding midnight shifts. Years of handling broken people and volatile nights had taught her how to think much faster than her own fear. Ethan softly agreed that he, too, had practice, though in a much darker arena. They sat together in that profound, fragile silence, unique to two strangers who have survived the unspeakable and are finally seeing the daylight. She asked him carefully if the attack was random, though the truth was already heavy in her chest. We often ask questions not to seek the truth, but to borrow a little more time before we are forced to accept the heavy burden of knowing it. He didn't blink. He confirmed it was someone who intimately knew the protocols of his dangerous family. Ethan looked at her then, his gaze sharp and subtly impressed. She had figured it out. She had understood that placing the phone call was the real danger. Pulling his father away or setting a trap, it meant the enemy understood exactly how the Sullivan machine operated. Ethan placed his mug down with a chilling precision. It's a hard lesson to swallow, listeners, but true danger rarely comes from strangers in the dark. the most devastating betrayals always come from those who have memorized the floor plan of your sanctuary. He confessed she wasn't what he had expected. He had expected someone trembling and broken. Emma's reply was brutally honest. She was terrified, running on fear since 2:17 this morning, but she simply refused to let panic dictate her face while they spoke. Hearing that, the invisible armor around Ethan seemed to fracture. Just for a second, she saw the raw human soul buried beneath the Sullivan machinery. Then the hammer fell. His father wanted to see her again tonight. We spend so much effort trying to appear unbreakable. But honestly, true courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is feeling completely terrified and refusing to let it sit in the driver's seat. Emma froze. She reminded him she had already met his father in a blood-soaked alley at 3 a.m. Ethan held her gaze, explaining that was merely a field assessment. Tonight was formal. His father wanted to thank her, yes, but more importantly, he wanted to understand her. Ethan chose his words with agonizing care, knowing their lethal weight. His father needed to dissect the mind of a woman who dared to keep secrets from him. You know, we are ultimately defined by the choices we make when no one is watching. But eventually, the world will demand to know why we made them, and we must be ready to stand behind our actions when the spotlight finally hits. Her eyes drifted over the mundane comfort of the diner. The humming coffee machines. Old Mr. Delgado reading his newspaper at table 3. The cook bickering with the dishwasher in the back. It was a perfectly ordinary life, about to be swallowed whole. She asked what would happen if she simply refused the invitation. Ethan's voice dropped, stripped of all pretense. He told her she could say no, but his father would fill the silence with his own dangerous assumptions. We cannot simply close our eyes and hope a storm passes us by. Avoidance is just another choice. And sometimes, refusing to participate in the conflict is the exact thing that draws the lightning straight to you. Emma understood the terrifying translation. Leaving Vincent Sullivan to his own imagination was a death sentence. "So it's not a choice at all," she whispered. A sudden, genuine laugh escaped her lips. It was the kind of helpless laughter, born entirely of absurdity, slipping out before her brain could lock it down. Ethan stared at her, genuinely bewildered by her spark. They agreed on 7 o'clock. Then he casually mentioned his father didn't know he was here. It's funny how a single sentence can change the temperature of a room. Sometimes we have to laugh when we are backed into a corner, if only to remind ourselves that we are still breathing. She caught the subtle shift in his posture, a micro-tension revealing the massive risk he was taking. He had come to the diner first, slipping under his father's radar purely to warn her. His instruction was simple but staggering. When the time came, she was to tell his father the absolute truth about what Ethan had said in the alley. He promised to take the heat for it. He wanted to free her from the burden of his lie. Listeners, genuine protection isn't about shielding someone from the truth. Real protection is stepping out into the line of fire so someone else doesn't have to carry a weight that was never theirs to bear in the first place. Emma searched his bruised face, asking why he cared so much about a stranger. Ethan's reply was soaked in years of quiet tragedy. He knew intimately what it cost to carry secrets for the Sullivan family, and he refused to let her soul be crushed under that same heavy toll. He stood dropping 2 bills on the counter. Far too much for a simple coffee, which she would have fought him over if given the chance. But she stopped him at the door. "Mr. Sullivan," she called out, demanding to know what he had whispered in the alley. Empathy usually comes from our deepest wounds. The people who fight the hardest to keep you out of the dark are always the ones who lived inside it. The entire diner seemed to freeze. the clatter of plates fading into a heavy silence. Ethan held her gaze from across the room for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ghost meant only for her. He confessed his suspicion. The hit was an inside job. And just like that, he pushed through the glass and faded away. Emma sat frozen, her coffee growing cold, crushed by the terrifying realization of what that meant. The people who cleared that alley in 4 minutes flat were part of the very machine now hunting him. You and I both know the hardest truth of all. The walls we build to keep the monsters out are completely useless when we realize we have already locked them inside with us. Welcome back to the midnight hour. Picture this with me. Someone in that brutal underworld had left Ethan Sullivan bleeding out in a pitch-black alley. His old man had no idea that Ethan knew the truth. But now Emma Turner, a diner waitress scraping by on $6 an hour, held that heavy secret in her hands. She folded her apron on the counter, the fabric worn thin from years of hard work, and went home to dress for a Mafia dinner. A black car rolled up exactly at 6:55. The silent driver held the door open like a trap. She climbed in without hesitation. That is the thing about making a real choice. The agony lives in the doubting before you step off the ledge. Once you fall, there is only the wind. Emma pressed her cheek against the cold glass house, watching her fractured world vanish. The cramped hoog sidewalks of her neighborhood melted into wide avenues and spotless stone facades. It was an entirely different city now, gleaming and cruel. She replayed Ethan's bitter warning in her head. His family had a talent for stripping away choices until only one remained. She realized she had been trapped the second she made that phone call. When they pulled up, the house was just a quiet, elegant townhouse. No towering gates, no guards, just the effortless beauty of old money. It teaches us a haunting lesson. True danger rarely announces itself with a scream. It usually waits for you behind a very quiet, very beautiful door. The massive door swung open before her foot even hit the top step. A woman with silver hair, pulled tight, and a soft-knit sweater stood in the frame. She looked exactly like the sweet grandmother who bakes cookies on a Sunday, which Emma knew was a total illusion. "Miss Turner," the woman murmured, her voice like warm honey. "Please come in. Mr. Sullivan is waiting." The second Emma stepped inside, the roaring noise of the city died. Complete, breathless silence. The woman, Rosa, drifted through the shadowy halls like a ghost who had haunted the place for centuries. She offered no directions, expecting blind obedience. Sometimes in life, the people who smile the warmest are the ones holding the heaviest keys. You and I have been in that exact spot, haven't we? Standing at the point of no return, the door was shut behind Emma, and Rosa was leading the way. So forward was the only way left to survive. Rosa stopped at a set of towering double doors, knocked twice, and gave a deeply unreadable smile. She offered coffee or water. Acting like this was a normal Tuesday visit. "I am fine," Emma replied, her voice steady. Rosa faded into the shadows. Emma stood alone before those doors. She pulled in one massive breath, drawing the air deep into the very bottom of her lungs, bracing for the impact. Life demands those deep breaths when you face your monsters. She pushed the heavy wood open. Vincent stood by the window, his back turned against her. Vincent did not turn around. He let her walk into the massive, silent room and just stand there like a stray dog. Emma knew this was no accident. Every single movement this man made was calculated to crush you. The long, agonizing silence was his way of saying, "I make the rules, and you entirely different than he had in the alley." He looked entirely different than he had. He was slick, polished, wearing a dark jacket with no tie. The desperate, bloody father from last night was gone, but his eyes were exactly the same. Cold and dead. It is a harsh truth to swallow, But you can dress a ruthless man in the finest silks, and his eyes will still tell you exactly how many souls he has buried. His gaze stripped her down, filing her away into some dark mental cabinet. "Miss Turner," he murmured. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," she replied, shocked by how unshaken her own voice sounded in that hollow room. He pointed to a chair. Instead of hiding behind a massive desk to flaunt his power, Vincent sat right across from her. No barriers, just two people in a deadly stare-down. "My son tells me you refused a car this afternoon," Vincent said smoothly. Emma froze. "Ethan actually told his father about the diner?" "My son tells me most things," the old man added, his tone utterly flat. "We often build walls to protect ourselves, but the smartest predators know that removing the table makes you feel far more afraid." A ghost of a smile crept across his jaw. "He came to you first," he noted. "What did you discuss?" Emma stared right back into the abyss of his eyes. She remembered Ethan begging her to tell the truth. She had to decide right then whose secrets were hers to spill. She spoke fast and clean, the way you have to when the knife is at your throat. "He thanked me," she said quietly. "He told me about the injury, and he asked me to tell you the truth about what he said in that alley." The room instantly turned into a graveyard. Vincent Sullivan stopped breathing, becoming unnaturally still. You learn a lot about a man by what makes him freeze. The deepest pain we carry is always triggered by the people who share our blood. That is where our armor fails. Listen closely to this moment, because you and I know how loud a quiet room can get. Vincent was perfectly still, but his brain was violently spinning behind those dark eyes. "Did he?" Vincent whispered. It was not a question. "Ethan thinks it was an inside job," Emma said, dropping the bomb with the flat, emotionless tone of a diner waitress reading back a receipt. "I am just passing the message." Vincent said absolutely nothing for 6 agonizing seconds. Emma counted every single one of them. 6 seconds of dead air from a lethal crime boss feels like drowning in a frozen lake. We spend our lives running from silence, filling it with noise, because total silence forces us to face the terrible, breaking things we cannot outrun. He finally rose from his chair, moving like a man with weights chained to his ankles, and drifted toward the glass. Emma watched the heavy slump of his shoulders. She was witnessing a father taking a bullet he always knew was coming, realizing that anticipating the pain did not make the bleeding any less severe. "He told this to a woman he met 4 hours ago?" Vincent asked the window. "I think that is exactly why he told me," Emma replied. "I am just a nobody from 5th Street. Talking to me did not cost him his loyalty or tip the scales of your dark politics. There is a strange, profound freedom in confessing to a stranger. When the people you love are the ones holding the knives, the only safe harbor left is a nobody in an alley." Vincent slowly turned around, fixing her with a look she would be haunted by for years. It was the tragic, shattered face of a powerful man who had just heard the honest truth from a waitress, because his own family was too terrified to speak it. "You are far sharper than you let on," he murmured. "I am exactly who I appear to be," Emma fired back. "You just made your own assumptions before I even walked in." The room went quiet again. Then, against all odds, the untouchable Vincent Sullivan almost smiled. A fleeting twitch of the lips, vanishing as fast as it arrived. It reminds us of a bitter fact. The most powerful people in the world are entirely starved for the one thing money can never buy: someone with the guts to tell them the truth. Emma knew the clear difference between a performance and a cracked mask. Last night, she saw a terrified father clutching his bleeding son. Tonight, she saw a broken king. He sank back into his chair, the tension easing slightly. "Tell me about yourself," he asked softly. She braced herself for an interrogation about the hitman, about Ethan, about the blood on the pavement. Instead, this terrifying boss just looked at her with raw, genuine curiosity. "There is not much to tell," Emma whispered. "The people with the least to say are usually the ones worth knowing the most," Vincent replied. "It is a beautiful tragedy, isn't it? The loudest people in the room are always empty, while the quiet ones carry the weight of the entire world on their backs." "My mother got sick, and I needed the cash," Emma said. She did not lower her eyes. She did not beg for pity. There was no shame in her voice, only the hardened steel of a girl who had to grow up far too fast to buy medicine for a dying parent. "Just me left," she added. Vincent took that in, letting the gravity of her loneliness settle. "And you walked through that alley because it was your shortcut," he mused. "You stopped." "I do not know why," she admitted. "I know why," Vincent said softly. "Because you are not someone who can just walk away. We live in a world where everyone turns a blind eye to suffering to protect themselves, but every now and then a rare soul stops in the dark. That kind of brutal empathy will always drag you into the fire. Think about how we survive in a city, you and I. We train ourselves to ignore the shadows." "It is basic survival," Vincent told her. "You never learned how to do that." He looked at her not with anger, but with profound respect. "It also saved my son's life." The heavy air in the room, suddenly my son's life. 3 agonizing words, completely stripped of his Mafia armor. Just a father staring at the girl who kept his boy breathing. "How is he?" Emma asked gently. "Angry," Vincent replied, "which means he is going to make it." Ethan goes completely silent when he is hurting. The lesson is carved into our scars. Anger is not always a weapon of destruction. Sometimes fury is the only fuel left that proves we are still fighting to survive. A shadow of true exhaustion drifted across Vincent's face, washing away the crime lord and leaving only an aging, terrified father. "Are you really glad?" he asked, letting the heavy weight of paranoia bleed into his voice. "Yes," Emma said without blinking, "I am glad he is alive." Vincent rested his elbows on his knees, looking like a man carrying a mountain of corpses on his back, that bone, deep weariness that only comes from outliving your own soul. "What are you going to do with what you know?" he asked softly. Emma held her ground. "Nothing," she replied. "The most dangerous currency in this dark world is not money, and it is not guns. It is trust. And sometimes the most profound gift you can give a broken family is to just bury their secrets." "Nothing," she repeated, her voice steady but hollow, like a bell in the dead of night. "I am going to go home. Tomorrow morning, I will pour coffee for Mr. Delgado at table 3 and erase this entire night from my memory." She paused, letting the heavy air settle. "I don't want a single thing from you. No reward, no favors. I found your boy bleeding. I made the call, and I stayed. I am not a player in whatever dangerous game this is." Vincent stared at her. The silence stretched so painfully thin that she began noticing the house breathing around them. The muffled footsteps. The antique clock chopping the quiet into merciless seconds. You and I both know you cannot unsee the dark once you step inside. Some doors, once opened, simply never close again. "That is exactly what someone who wanted to be a player would say," Vincent murmured, his voice a low rumble in the dim room. "I know," Emma replied. "I cannot prove a negative. You will have to decide what you believe." Vincent let out a slow breath. "I told you last night I choose to believe you, that stands." He paused, the air growing colder. "But you need to understand. What you know now puts you in a place where your innocent intentions do not matter at all." A chill spilled down Emma's spine. He was not threatening her. He was handing her the ugly truth. She was inside his fortress now. The hardest truth we ever learn is that pure intentions cannot shield us from the bloody reality of the world. Once you know the secret, you become part of it. Other people out in the dark, the ones who lacked Vincent's rare mercy, would paint their own bloody pictures. "Someone tried to hurt your boy," she said. Her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know who. Now there is a loose thread. Me, whoever ordered the hit, might start pulling that thread before you catch them." Vincent's face stayed carved from stone, but his dark eyes shifted. "You are not what I expected," he confessed. A strange shiver went through her. Ethan had spoken those exact words hours earlier. Father and son, bound by the same protective instinct. "I know," she breathed. "Tell me, what were you expecting me to ask for when I walked in?" We often walk straight into our terrifying destiny while desperately trying to avoid it altogether. "Honestly, I thought you were going to demand cash to keep quiet," Vincent admitted, his deep voice carrying a quiet weariness. "I was fully prepared to pay it. It is the practical move. But deep down, I would have been incredibly disappointed." Emma held his hard gaze. "Funny. I thought you were going to shove a checkbook in my face, and I would have to decide whether to act offended or be practical." Vincent tilted his head, curiosity breaking through. "And which would you have chosen?" Emma gave a bitter, small laugh. "Probably both. I am a very efficient person. For one fleeting second, the ghost of a smile touched the old boss's lips. "We all build thick, heavy walls to survive, but real courage is knowing when to let someone peek through the cracks." She felt the change in the air immediately. It was that silent, heavy shift you feel in your chest right before a midnight storm breaks. "I am not going to offer you money," Vincent said smoothly. "I am giving you something far more valuable." He pulled the heavy oak door open. Rosa materialized out of the hallway like a phantom. Vincent murmured something low and rough. Rosa gave a single nod and vanished into the dark. Vincent turned slowly back to Emma. "I am giving you a number, my absolute personal line. I want you to dial it the second you feel eyes on your back. If a car lingers too long, if anything feels wrong. You and I both know that safety is a strange illusion. Sometimes the very shield that promises to protect you is exactly what makes you a target." Emma stared at him, her heart thumping against her ribs. "You actually think I am in danger?" Vincent chose his neck like he was defusing a bomb. "I think that I do not know yet. And until I am certain, I would rather you be able to reach me in 30 seconds than need help and not have it." The heavy door creaked open behind him. Ethan stepped into the dim light. He was scanning the tension, reading the tight muscles in his father's back, piecing the puzzle together in real time. "You told him," Ethan stated. "You told me to do it," she replied softly. An agonizing conversation passed between them without a single syllable spoken. The deepest, most permanent scars we carry are often given to us in utter silence by the people we love the most. "Who do you think ordered the hit?" Vincent fired the question at his boy, no sugarcoating. The words dropped into the quiet room like a heavy stone plunging into black water. Ethan did not flinch, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. His hesitation told the whole story. He had a name burning right behind his eyes, a face he wanted to ruin. "We are not doing this here," Ethan muttered, darting a protective glance toward Emma. "She stays," Vincent commanded, his voice rumbling like thunder. "She is a civilian," Ethan argued. "She stopped being a civilian the exact second she dialed for help last night." Vincent fired back. In a world built entirely on bloody lies, protecting an innocent stranger is sometimes the only way a ruined man can find redemption. Emma sank into her chair, watching this wordless war unfold between father and son. You and I can only imagine the sheer exhaustion of growing up in their twisted reality. A life where even the quiet moments are loaded with gunpowder, where every breathing second is a calculated move. Ethan turned his dark, bruised gaze onto her. She stared right back, refusing to shrink. She had not begged for a seat at this violent table. This was Vincent's ruling. and she was done apologizing for simply surviving. Caruso! Ethan finally spat out. The name sounded like absolute venom. He kept his eyes locked onto Emma as he said it. Sometimes we learn the most about the darkest demons in our lives only after we are brave enough to say their names out loud. Vincent let the poisonous name hang in the air, his face unreadable. Marco Caruso. Ethan pressed on, frustration bleeding through. His soldiers had been crawling into our East Side territory for 6 months. We argued about this. You commanded me to wait. Ethan tried to keep his tone flat, but a deep, ugly resentment was bubbling right beneath the surface. Well, I got tired of waiting. I made a play last week. And exactly 3 days later, someone trailed me and shoved a blade deep into my ribs. The silence that crashed down on the room was suffocating. You made a move, Vincent repeated softly. Without my clearance. Yes, Ethan fired back. Resentment grows best in the dark, watering itself on the crucial words we are too afraid to say out loud. Why? The single word left Vincent's lips like a dying breath, fragile yet entirely devastating. Ethan glared back at the man who raised him. Because I knew you would tell me no. A flash of pure agony crossed Vincent's weathered face. It was not just raw anger. It was mourning the profound grief of a fading king realizing his own fortress was poisoned from within. You thought, Vincent started, that Caruso already had rats inside our walls. You believed my own men would leak it to the enemy. Ethan just stood there, letting the heavy silence scream his confirmation. The old man turned away toward the tall window. There is absolutely no heartbreak, quite like realizing the home you built to keep. Monsters out is exactly where they were born. Watching the rigid slope of Vincent's shoulders, Emma realized she was watching a Titan's universe collapse. How long? Vincent whispered to the glass pane. How long have you believed we had a traitor breathing our air? Ethan swallowed hard. 4 months. The timeline slammed into Vincent's back like a physical blow. You could almost see the old man's spine bow under the weight. And you kept me in the dark. I had no hard proof. Ethan's restraint finally snapped. All I have are dirty patterns and a blade buried in my ribs. His tough exterior cracked, exposing the terrified boy underneath. I did not want to be wrong about this, Dad. Vulnerability is terrifying. But it is the only weapon strong enough to break down a wall built foolish pride. It wasn't the loaded silence of criminal empires. It was just a broken son calling for his father. A plain, raw truth. Emma felt a harsh lump rise in her throat. Vincent slowly rotated away from the black window. His expression had shifted into something of bloody war. Trapped somewhere between a general commanding a bloody war and a father terrified of losing his child. It was a miserable purgatory he had occupied for decades. He stared at his wounded boy before his dark eyes drifted to Emma. Miss Turner, he rasped, I owe you a massive apology. You just wanted a shortcut home. Instead, you walked right into a nightmare. Life rarely punishes us for our sins. It usually punishes us for being in the wrong place when the devil comes to collect his dues. He let the grim reality hang there. I am deeply sorry. Being hunted is not the reward you deserved for choosing to do the right thing. Emma studied Vincent. This powerful phantom with his silver hair and the crushing fatherly terror he wore beneath his suit like a second skin. Her mind drifted back to the diner, recalling Ethan's battered face, remembering how he never wanted the danger to start for her. The father and the son. Using different words, both men were desperately trying to protect a stranger who had slipped into their violent underworld. Emma lifted her chin. Do not apologize just yet. Wait until we see how this ugly story ends. You and I both know that sometimes the deepest honor is found hiding inside the darkest of people. We, Emma said, her voice barely a whisper in the heavy room. She didn't take the word back. The grandfather clock against the wall ticked away, marking the decisive death of her old life. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked shut. Out there, the city was blindly stumbling through its ordinary nighttime routines, unaware that a simple diner waitress had just crossed a point of no return. She was a woman who had finally made peace with a quiet, invisible life. Someone who stayed safe and went home to a worn-out couch that knew her exact shape. But that version of herself felt like a ghost now. She lifted her chin, looking right at Vincent and Ethan Sullivan. Sometimes, my friends, the shortcuts we take in life never lead to the destination we expected to find. She left the Sullivan house at 9:47, and by 6:15 the next morning, she was tying her apron back at the diner. That is exactly who Emma Turner was. She could stare down a life-altering danger, then turn around and pour cheap coffee. The rent was still due, and bills do not care about your tragedies. Neither did Mr. Delgado, waiting on his eggs and rye toast. But the quiet geometry of her world had already started to fracture. It always happens in small ways first, doesn't it? The black sedan from yesterday was gone. Now a silver car sat half a block down. Different make, different plates. The universe always warns us when the storm is coming. If we only take a moment to look at the signs. The silver car was there when she clocked in and completely gone by 11. 2 blocks down, a different vehicle had taken its place. If she hadn't been watching the shadows exactly the way Vincent Sullivan instructed, she would have missed it. She didn't call the emergency number. Because showing panic to the wrong people is a fast way to become a victim. She just swallowed her fear and kept working. At 1 in the afternoon, a stranger sat at her counter. He ordered apple pie, stared at his phone, and left a $20 bill for a $7 tab without ever looking her in the eye. You and I both know that the quietest people in the room are usually the ones carrying the most dangerous secrets. Emma had refilled his mug twice, wearing her best service smile while studying his body language. She noticed how he sat with his back firmly against the wall, eyes tracking the front door. It is the undeniable posture of someone trained to never drop their guard. After he left, she found a small folded paper tucked under his empty cup. She scooped it up effortlessly, treating it like a discarded receipt, and buried it in her apron pocket. She calmly delivered 3 plates to table 6, topped off the salt shakers, and only pulled the note out when she was completely hidden in the dim back hallway. 4 words, handwritten in clean, precise letters. Do not go home tonight. Sometimes, the most terrifying warnings in our lives arrive in the absolute simplest packaging. Emma stood perfectly still in that hallway for exactly 10 seconds. Then she folded the paper, shoved it into her pocket, and marched right out to face the lunch crowd. At 2 o'clock, she dialed Vincent from inside the walk-in freezer. It was her only private sanctuary, smelling of industrial frost, and the bitter loneliness of a woman hiding between soup stock and frozen pastries. He picked up immediately. "Was the note yours?" she asked, without bothering to say hello. One heavy beat of silence passed. "No," Vincent replied, and her stomach completely plummeted to the floor. When you and I finally ask the hardest questions, we must be fully prepared for answers that might break us. She quickly rattled off the stranger's description, his tense posture, and the heavy tip left behind. Through the receiver, she heard Vincent murmuring to someone else in the room. Then he came back to the line. "Emma," he said softly. It was the first time he had dropped the formal title, and hearing her name in his deep voice felt like catching a live wire. He ordered her to stay inside the diner after her shift. Someone would come for her, but she must not leave with anyone who didn't use the code word. November, she repeated the month out loud, letting the word anchor her mind. He told her not to be frightened. "I am frightened, but I am functional," she confessed. Over the line, the older man let out a soft breath that almost sounded like genuine warmth. True courage isn't about being completely fearless. It is simply about taking the next step, even when your hands are trembling. She did exactly as told and stayed inside. She scrubbed the coffee machines twice and nervously rye-stocked napkin dispensers that were already full. When her manager asked if she was okay, Emma just blamed it on a long week. "Honey, it is only Wednesday," the manager sighed. "I know." At 3:22, the brass bell above the door finally chimed. She had been bracing herself for one of Vincent's massive, silent barred to step out of the house. Instead, Ethan Sullivan walked in. He wore a rumpled gray jacket, looking like a man who had barely slept and was running entirely on dangerous adrenaline and old regrets. Sometimes the universe sends us exactly who we need to carry us through the dark, rather than the person we logically expected to see. "November," Ethan said, his voice rough before she could even speak. "That is the word." She nodded, the heavy knot in her chest loosening. He told her they needed to move fast. His father had not sent him. Ethan had actively volunteered to step into the fire for her. She pulled off her apron, ignored her manager's skeptical glare about her sudden emergencies, and followed him out. An older, unremarkable car was idling at the curb, perfectly designed to vanish into city traffic. Ethan slid into the driver's seat, catching her off guard once more. They were speeding down the street before her passenger door even clicked shut. When you finally trust someone with your survival, you stop worrying about the destination and simply hold on for the long, dangerous ride. "We do not know who left the note," Ethan muttered, his dark eyes flicking to the rearview mirrors. Emma was learning that this hypervigilance was standard in his world. He explained that the stranger's cold posture and precise tip were not random. It was a message from someone who knew she had visited the Sullivan house. "They want me scared," she whispered. "They want you gone," Ethan corrected. "Scared people make noise," he explained. "But gone people stop being a problem altogether." Someone was frantically trying to cut the loose threads before his father found the traitor inside their organization. And right now, Emma was the most fragile thread of all. The brutal truth of life is that innocence will never protect you from the blade when someone decides it is time to clean house. He had warned her yesterday, but the terrifying reality felt much heavier today. Ethan smoothly whipped the car across 2 lanes. He revealed that his father had been making quiet, dangerous phone calls all night, hunting for the rat-feeding secrets to their rivals. Whoever that traitor was, they could feel the walls closing in, and when desperate men get rushed, they get terribly sloppy. Leaving a threatening note at a public diner was a panicked move. Emma sat frozen, staring down at her trembling hands. She thought about her tiny apartment, the warm hum of her kitchen clock, and the peaceful view from her window. You and I never truly appreciate the beautiful, safe boredom of an ordinary life until the exact moment it is violently stripped away from us. She grieved for her shattered peace and the dark blur of the last 36 hours that had burned it down. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," Ethan replied, "while my father handles the next 12 hours. The hardened man let out a heavy sigh and apologized yet again. "Stop," Emma said softly, her tone laced with pure iron. She told him she had made her own choices every step of the way, refusing to let him take her agency by shouldering the blame. Ethan glanced over at her, his dark eyes lingering on her face much longer than the road required. When he finally looked away, he caught admiring a beautiful thing he had no right to hold. True respect between two people is always forged in the hot crucible of our most terrifying moments. They drove in silence for 20 minutes. The city thinned out, then thickened again into a quiet neighborhood. Ethan parked at an old brownstone, unlocked the heaver and held it open her. "Whose place is this?" she asked, stepping inside. "Mine," he answered quietly. "Not the family house. Mine." The shift in the atmosphere was absolute. His father's grand mansion had been a cold museum piece designed to intimidate its guests. But this apartment was wonderfully different. It was a private space where a dangerous man actually lived and breathed when he stripped off his armor. You and I can learn everything we need to know about a person's soul by simply looking at the secret sanctuary they build for themselves when the rest of the world stops us watching. Emma saw paperback books stacked in the corner, an unwashed mug on the table, and a jacket draped loosely over a chair. Against all logic, standing inside the hidden den of a dangerous man, she felt an unexpected wave of peace. "Sit wherever you want," Ethan told her, walking toward the kitchen. He warned her that his cooking was technically legal, but morally questionable. Emma tried to decline, but her exhausted stomach fiercely disagreed, growling with the deep hunger of someone running on pure terror. "Whatever you have is fine," she surrendered. She sank deep into the soft cushions of the couch, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she let her brave composure fall away. We all wear heavy armor to survive the cruel world, but eventually we just need a quiet, messy room where we can take it off and breathe. You know, late at night, when shadows stretch across the room, we all just want an escape. Emma tilted her head back, pulling in 3 slow breaths, sinking past the terror into that quiet stillness. "Are you okay?" Ethan called out from the kitchen. "Fine," she lied. "Distract me. Tell me something completely unrelated to this mess." The clinking of a spoon echoed out. "I wanted to be an architect," he said finally. Emma blinked. "Really?" "Until I was 19, he replied, his voice rough. "I loved the structure of it. But my grandfather got sick, my dad needed me, and the dream died. It teaches you something hard. Sometimes the plans we build for ourselves fall apart just so the people we love can stay standing." "Do you resent it?" Emma asked, the words hanging heavy in the air. Ethan paused, the raw honesty of it bruising the quiet. "Some days I see a beautiful building and it hurts. Then I force myself to think of something else." He leaned against the kitchen doorway, casting a long shadow. "What about you?" he asked. "What did you want to be?" Emma froze. Nobody had asked her that since she was 16. Dreams are a luxury when survival takes over. "A teacher," she whispered. "When I was 12, I used to set up a little classroom in my living room for the neighborhood kids." It is a quiet tragedy how easily we forget our childhood dreams. The truest parts of who we are often get buried under the brutal demands of just making it to tomorrow. "My mother used to watch me and just laugh," Emma added softly. Not a cruel laugh, just smiling at how seriously I took it. Ethan's face melted into something gently tragic. "Why didn't you do it?" he asked. "Same reason you did not," she replied. "Life got in the way of living." Ethan stared at her. For the first time, his eyes lacked their cold calculation. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, a crack in the heavy armor they both carried. 10 minutes later, he returned with 2 steaming bowls of pasta. It was a simple meal, but it tasted like genuine care. We spend so much energy putting up walls to protect ourselves. Yet the moments that actually save us are the ones where we sit down, drop the act, and let someone else feed our tired souls. You and I have both sat in heavy silences, the kind that feel strangely right. Emma finally put her bowl down. "Caruso," she said, "tell me who he is." Ethan mirrored her, resting his elbows on his knees. It was the exact posture his father used, a dark genetic trait the Sullivan men shared when the truth was about to bleed out. "Marco Caruso runs the East Side, has for about 8 years, Ethan explained. His jaw locked in tension. He and my dad had an arrangement that kept the blood off the streets. But then my father pulled back, handing me the reins. Caruso saw that transition as weakness and made his move. It is a harsh truth of the world. People will always test your boundaries the moment you try to step back and find a little peace. It started small, Ethan murmured, staring hard at his own hands, little accidents you could brush off, until I shut down one of his supply lines. No violence, just a silent message that the door was closed. I should have warned my father. I lied to myself, claiming I was saving him the stress. Emma watched the guilt eat at him. "You just wanted to prove something," she said softly. "You wanted to show him you could handle the empire without holding his hand." The silence that followed was suffocating. Emma worried she had cut too deep with her honesty. But we often hurt the ones we love most when we try to prove our independence. Sometimes leaning on the people who raised us isn't a sign of weakness, life, but the very thing that keeps us safe. "Yeah," Ethan breathed out the word thick with regret. "That is exactly it." He rubbed his face, exhausted. "Someone inside our own house told Caruso what I did. Now here we are." Emma leaned in. "Who else knows about this leak?" "Just my father's top men, Luca and Dom," Ethan replied. "Do you trust them?" she asked. "My father trusts them," he deflected. Emma did not blink. "That is not what I asked." Ethan stared back, the shadows deepening around his eyes. "I trust Luca. Dom I only suspect because of a gut feeling, but my father demands hard proof, and finding a traitor who knows you are hunting them is nearly impossible," she finished. "Trust is a fragile glass. Once you realize it might be cracked, you spend the rest of your life watching where you step. Stay with me here, because this is where the dark game changes entirely." Emma sat perfectly still. Outside, the low hum of a passing car made her flinch. She was learning the agonizing instinct of prey, only exhaling when the engine faded. "The warning note I got. If your family did not send it, Caruso did. That means your inside man fed my name to the enemy. They know I was at your house. They know I spoke to your father behind closed doors, and now they are terrified of what I might have exposed." Ethan stared at her, the gravity of her words sinking in. "Walk me through it," he demanded quietly. "Fear is a powerful compass. If you want to know what someone is hiding, just watch what makes them panic and rush to cover their tracks." "The traitor knows the wind shifted last night," Emma said, her voice laced with dread. They watched a nobody waitress get pulled to the boss' private study, followed by urgent phone calls. She locked eyes with Ethan. "They are not trying to scare me off because I am a threat. They are spooked because they have no idea what I actually know. And the unknown is always 1,000 times worse than the truth." The air between them hummed with dangerous electricity. "You put all that together in 45 seconds, Ethan muttered, entirely stunned. Emma offered a broken smile. "I had a lot of time to think while pouring coffee today. The mind is a brilliant weapon. Even when we feel totally powerless, our ability to connect the hidden dots is the one thing nobody can take from us." "Emma," he murmured, testing the heavy weight of her name on his tongue. "What you just laid out, that is pure leverage. Their terror over what you might know is the only thing keeping you breathing right now." "I understand," she whispered, feeling the cold reality wash over her. "My father needs to hear this," Ethan decided. He grabbed his phone and made the call. Vincent answered on the second ring. "You are on speaker," Ethan announced, dropping the phone onto the coffee table. It sat there like a dark bridge connecting their separate worlds of grief. "She has something," Ethan told his father. "In life, your greatest vulnerability can become your strongest shield. Letting people fear what you might know is sometimes the only way to survive their wrath." Emma leaned forward, staring at the phone, and laid out the brutal truth. She gave it to Vincent straight, cold, and sequential. The warning note was a symptom of panic, not just a threat. She explained how her mere existence was leverage simply because of the traitor's paranoia. When she finished speaking, a hollow silence drifted out of the speaker. "You want us to use your ambiguity as bait?" Vincent finally rasped. "The bait is already in the water," she replied calmly. "The only question now is if you will use it to catch the rat." Ethan's voice dropped to a pained whisper. "Dom," he told his father. "Don't," Vincent warned. "It is a terrifying realization. When you decide to stop running and start using the traps set against you, you finally stop being the victim and become the hunter. Listen closely, because betrayal never comes from strangers." "Dad," Ethan pleaded, the betrayal burning in his throat, "this rat knew she was at our house. They moved fast enough to get a guy into her diner by 1 o'clock. Only someone managing your hourly schedule could pull that off. Luca does not have that access." The pause that followed felt like a coffin closing. "Dom does," Ethan finished. The silence radiating from the phone changed entirely. Over the learned-to-read Vincent hours, Emma had learned to read Vincent's moods. But this one was suffocating. It was a man bleeding out from a wound he never saw coming. 22 years, Vincent choked out. "We give people our years and our blind trust, and nothing is more tragic than realizing they used every single piece of it against us." Vincent's voice was violently controlled, masking the devastation beneath it. "Dom has been with our family for 22 years, he whispered. Emma turned away, feeling like an intruder witnessing a private grief. "I know, Dad," Ethan replied softly, "but I will get you the proof. Just need you to let me handle it cleanly." "No rash moves, Ethan." Vincent sighed. "I learned my lesson. But let me handle this." The heavy pause felt endless before Vincent finally yielded. "Tell me the plan first." It was a stunning surrender, a father finally stepping aside for his son. Ethan met Emma's eyes, and she watched the exact moment the torch was passed. It is a profound turning point in life. That moment, we stop seeking our parents' permission and finally step up to shoulder the terrible burdens they can no longer carry alone. You could almost hear the internal architecture of Ethan Sullivan rearranging itself. An iron wall inside him was quietly crumbling into dust, making way for the man he was forced to become. "Emma is the plan," Ethan stated. Emma froze, her blood running cold. "She is the loose thread they are panicking over," Ethan explained. "We make them think she ran away. But really, she is our ghost. Nobody suspects a bruised waitress from 5th Street to be playing the game, especially Dom. Dom writes off anyone who wasn't born into our dark world." "Ethan!" Vincent barked, his voice sharp with alarm. Arrogance is always a fatal flaw. When you convince yourself someone is weak just because of where they come from, you hand them the exact invisible weapon they need to destroy you. "What exactly are you proposing?" Vincent demanded. "Just a conversation," Ethan replied smoothly. "We stage an accidental meeting between Dom and Emma. A random encounter where she drops enough vague hints to let his own guilty conscience fill in the blanks. His Sriaga will give Malkas Dom and Urthel the proof we need." He paused, his voice softening. "She is good at this. Dad, you talked to her last night. You felt it. You and I know how loud silence can be," and the pause on the line stretched agonizingly. 15 seconds. 20. Emma counted the seconds, desperate to anchor her racing mind. It teaches us a vital lesson about human nature. You rarely have to force a confession out of a guilty soul. If you just give them enough silence and a little bit of rope, they will almost always hang themselves. She realized they were pulling her into the center of storms she had never asked for. The voice on the line was firm. "No one will compel you. I want that said in front of my son, so there is no ambiguity." A heavy pause. What do you want to do?" Emma closed her eyes. She thought about the note left under her coffee cup, the silver car idling in the dark. She thought of a man hiding in Vincent's inner circle for 22 years, feeding secrets to the ghost who stabbed Ethan, and left him to die in a freezing alley she had walked 1,000 times. You and I know that in life the hardest choices are the ones where doing nothing hurts worse than the fire. She knew the agonizing cost of letting that kind of betrayal walk away unpunished. Her mind drifted to her mother, a woman who spent her entire life walking past the ugly things, suffocating under a blanket of quiet regrets. Emma refused to inherit that silence. "Tell me about Dom," she said. She heard Vincent let out a faint breath, a single drop of relief in a dead room. 61 years old, he told her, a careful man. Deeply vain, considers himself the absolute best judge of character we have. In the background, Ethan made a low noise that proved just how blind Dom really was. "He holds court at restaurants," Vincent continued. "He will be at Carmine's on Thursday." "Thursday," she echoed. 2 days. Ethan tried to stop her. "You do not have to do this. I know I do not have to," she replied, staring straight into the dark with eyes wide open. "Stop treating me like I am made of glass. I am not fragile." Her tone was a steady drumbeat. "I am a woman who has spent 12 years managing difficult, unpredictable people in confined spaces. I can sit across from a man at a dinner table and walk away with the exact secrets you need to survive." She let the silence stretch, forcing them to feel her absolute gravity. "What I need is everything you know about him. How he speaks, what inflates his pride, what terrifies him in the dark. I need the vanities and the soft spots." A suffocating stillness hung between the three of them. Then Ethan spoke, his voice so quiet it was barely more than an exhale. "Okay," and Vincent echoed it. His tone had shifted far past calculation, settling into a dark resolve that was ancient, heavy, and absolute. 2 days felt like endless weeks, and yet like 2 frantic minutes. That is the specific cruelty of time when you are bracing for an impact you cannot prepare for. Thursday was racing toward her. She had 48 hours to become the exact woman a predator like Dom expected to see, a helpless shadow and nothing more. She had spent 12 long years being underestimated by the world. Now, she was about to find out what that invisibility was worth. She worked her shift at the diner, moving exactly as she always did. Efficient and quiet. She poured the bitter coffee, wiped the tables, and offered that tired, professional smile. "Have a good day," she murmured to passing strangers who would forget her face before the heavy glass door even swung shut. She played her part to perfection. To Dom and his associates, she was a frightened woman who had swallowed a warning and faded away. But in the hollow hours between closing the diner and trying to sleep, the mask came off. She sat at her kitchen table, voice into her ear. She memorized Domenico Ferraro the way she knew every wobbly table in her diner. By feel, by rhythm, by the tragic human grammar of what a man desired and how he demanded to be served. Dom was 61. He had run with the Sullivans since the old man was in charge. He was practically furniture, so deeply embedded that people simply forgot to watch him. He was cautious, yes, but not out of panic or fear. He was careful strictly out of a cold, deeply rusted habit. He lived in a deep groove, carved by decades of standing inches from the fire, without ever letting the flames touch him. He was fiercely proud of his ability to read a room. He believed he was the family's finest judge of character, a delusion Ethan shattered with a lifeless tone over the line. Dom was tragically vain. He loved the quiet respect at expensive restaurants. He craved the lingering stares of women who carried enough miles on their souls to know what they were looking at. Emma Turner was 32 years old. She had been tossed aside and underestimated since the day she turned 16. She knew exactly how to mold herself into the kind of woman a man like Dom would gaze at, categorize, and completely dismiss within the first 30 seconds. "Do not pry the truth out of him," Ethan warned her. His voice was a gravelly whisper. "Just be a presence. Be the mirror he wants to talk to. Let him spill into the empty air. You and I both know that arrogant men will always suffocate in silence. They need their own voice to feel alive, to avoid that terrible loss of control." "And when he brings up the Sullivans," Emma murmured, "because he absolutely will." Ethan sighed. "Yes, when he does, look shaken. Act like walking into that house broke something inside you. Like you are still bleeding from the memory. That will not be hard," she replied. "The Emma," he whispered. His voice dropped, losing all its polished armor. It hit that raw, jagged register she'd finally learned to recognize as his absolute, unfiltered truth. "If anything feels wrong, you leave. You do not explain. You just stand up and walk out." "Luca will be in the restaurant, I know," she sighed. "You told me 3 times. I am telling you a 4th, he insisted. "Ethan, stop. I will be fine." A terrible aching pause hung over the line. Then, his voice almost breaking, "You do not have to do this." "I know," she said softly. She thought the words again, but swallowed them. "Good night." She slept for exactly 4 hours. When her eyes snapped open at 5, the city was still drowning in darkness. She lay perfectly still in her cold apartment. She did what she always did when terror tried to paralyze her. She invited the fear into the room and had a direct, unflinching conversation with it. She laid the creeping nightmare out plainly. She looked at the true dimensions of the threat, ignoring the twisted shadow it threw on the wall. The worst case? Dom recognized the trap. He saw right through her disguise. If that happened, she stood up and walked out. Luca was waiting. Vincent would handle the fallout. And the best case? Dom talked. Driven by the tragic vanity of a man who spent 22 years believing he was the smartest shark in the water, he would hand Vincent the exact rope to hang him with. Everything else was just idle talk. Emma had been navigating brutal, life-altering conversations since she was a 12-year-old girl forced to grow up too fast. She could survive one more. You and I both know, sometimes survival is just a matter of refusing to blink. She got out of bed, brewed coffee, and put on her armor. Thursday. Carmine's was an establishment that knew exactly what it was and had stopped apologizing for its arrogance. Emma walked in at 12:45, perfectly alone, requesting a window table. The hostess seated her without a second glance. Emma had perfected the bearing of a woman who belonged exactly where she sat. She ordered a sparkling water and stared straight ahead. She refused to scan the dining room for Luca. Searching for her unseen protector was exactly the desperate telepredator like Dom would spot from across the floor. At 1:05, the devil walked in. She knew him instantly from the photograph. Heavy set, silver hair swept back, wearing a tailored jacket that screamed quiet, brutal money. He glided through the room with the comfort of a king returning to his throne. He greeted the maitre d' by name and clasped a hand at a corner booth. Emma realized he was performing his total ease just like she was performing hers. His act was so polished over the decades that he had forgotten it was an act at all. He noticed her before he even reached his chair. She felt the heavy weight of his gaze drag across her profile, stopping for a fraction of a second. It was the calculated pause of a hunter spotting something interesting and weighing the chase. She was staring out the window when it happened, a deliberate move. She turned her head back to the room at the precise moment to find his eyes on her, letting herself look momentarily, beautifully caught. She offered him a small, wonderfully distracted smile, the look of a woman whose heart was miles away. He sat down, flanked by 2 men. She clocked their presence in her periphery but never stared. She slowly ate her first course, letting the tension marinate. She was halfway through her glass when his shadow fell over her. "Forgive me," Dom murmured. His voice was warm, dripping with practiced confidence. "You look like you are waiting for someone who is not going to show up. I have been that person at that exact table." He flashed a self-deprecating smile. "Domenico Ferraro, I do not mean to intrude." She looked up, playing the surprise flawlessly. "Emma," she breathed. "No last name, just Emma. It is supposed way you offer a name when you supposedly have nothing to hide." "And no, I am not waiting," she replied softly. "Just thinking. May I?" He gestured to the empty chair. She hesitated for exactly the right fraction of a second. It was a masterpiece of restraint, the hesitation of a woman who was mildly uncertain but not unfriendly. "Of course." She nodded. He sank into the chair, ordering a drink from a passing server without a menu. It was the quiet flex of a man whose memories were built into the very walls. He began to ask about her life. His tone was gentle, woven with the practiced interest of a predator who knows victims only open their hearts when they feel seen, rather than interrogated. She fed him a sanitized version of the truth. "You and I know the most bulletproof lies are always anchored in reality." She told him she was just a waitress. "You and I have both met people who listen a little too closely, haven't we?" Emma sat across from Dom, letting the silence stretch. She told him her week had been unusual, trying to clear her head. Dom's eyes were warm, locked onto hers with absolute attention. But Emma saw the cold machinery moving behind that warmth, the kind of listening that was quietly gathering ammunition. She dropped her gaze to her water glass, letting her face do the heavy lifting. A slight tightening around the eyes, a micro-tension in the jaw. She had rehearsed this exact hesitation in her bathroom mirror for an hour. "I met some people I wasn't expecting," she murmured, carefully acting like a woman out of her depth. Powerful people. The life lesson here is simple. Sometimes playing the fool is the sharpest weapon you can wield. Dom held her gaze, and Emma watched the subtle shift in his eyes. It wasn't surprise. It was a sudden, razor-sharp interest, exactly like a guard dog's ears, twitching toward a sound in the dark. "That sounds uncomfortable," he said smoothly. "It was clarifying," she replied, letting the heavy word just sit right there on the table. She wanted him to sweat over what it meant. "I thought I knew how things worked. Turns out I knew nothing, and now I know more than I ever intended." Then came the silence, 3 ticking seconds that stretched into eternity. In that tiny window, Dom Ferraro made the exact mistake she would later report to Ethan. He didn't ask what she knew an innocent man always asks. The lesson is undeniable. The questions people choose not to ask will always tell you exactly what they are hiding. Instead of asking, Dom smiled a perfectly hollow smile and smoothly changed the subject. "Powerful people can be a lot of things," he said softly. "Mostly. They just got very good at one specific thing very early on." He never asked who she met. He never asked what secret she was holding. He just slid the conversation sideways, with the effortless grace of a man who had spent 22 years dodging the truth. Looking at him, Emma felt a cold, perfect clarity settle into her bones. Ethan was right all along. She kept the act alive for another 20 minutes, generously feeding him her fake uncertainty and visible unease. It teaches us a hard truth about life. When you finally see someone for who they truly are, you can never unsee it, no matter how beautiful their mask might be. She let Dom believe he was the one driving conversation, filling every silence she intentionally left empty. When she finally walked out of Carmine's, her legs felt unsteady, shaking from the sheer adrenaline of the performance. She barely made it half a block before Luca materialized from the shadows, falling into step beside her like a heavy, silent ghost. "Car is around the corner," he muttered. She shot him a sideways glance. "I heard," he added. She stopped dead in her tracks, realizing he had wired the room. Mr. Sullivan wanted to be absolutely certain. She swallowed her anger, realizing it wasn't worth the energy to fight. It teaches us a bitter reality. Trust is an expensive currency, and powerful men prefer to verify it. "He is waiting," Lucas said quietly. "Both of them. Let us step into that room together, you and I." Vincent was already on his feet when she walked in, with Ethan standing like a shadow right beside him. The heavy tension in the air proved they had heard every single word. The ghost of her conversation with Dom was still breathing in the room. Emma sat down slowly, though neither man moved. "He didn't ask," she said, her voice steady. "No," Vincent replied. "He didn't. He had sidestepped her traps twice, pivoting away from the danger instead of walking into it." Emma looked right into Vincent's eyes. An innocent man asks questions. A man with something to protect redirects. Vincent's voice was hollowed out, stripped down to bare, painful facts. The lesson rings true for us all. Silence and deflection are often the loudest confessions a guilty heart can make. "No," Emma agreed softly. But it is exactly what Ethan said it would be, a confirmation or a clearing, and he certainly did not clear himself. The silence that followed was the heaviest, darkest quiet she had ever experienced. She sat perfectly Sullivan, mentally weigh 22 years of absolute trust against 40 minutes of audio caught by a waitress. She did not rush him. Some painful truths demand to be felt in their entirety before you can carry them. Ethan looked at her across the dimly lit room, and she met his eyes. It wasn't a spoken conversation, but a profound recognition. A life lesson written in blood. Sometimes two broken people can start from completely opposite ends of the earth only to find themselves standing in the exact same fire. Finally understood. "I need to make a call," Vincent said, quietly, slipping out into the hallway. Cracked, and Emma could hear his low, terribly controlled voice repeating a name she did not recognize. Ethan moved slowly, sinking into the chair his father had just emptied. He was close enough now that she could see the raw, bruising exhaustion carved into his face, 4 days of pure survival hanging heavy under his eyes. "You were right about him, underestimate the quiet." Ethan nodded slowly. "Naruto, it made me angry," she confessed. "Even though it was the whole point, even though I was counting on it to survive. Here is a truth we all must learn. Being invisible is a powerful shield that a boy, but it still breaks your heart every time someone looks right through you." "He looked right at me and saw absolutely nothing worth worrying about," Emma said, the sting still fresh. 20 seconds. That is all it took him to dismiss my entire existence." Ethan watched her, his voice gentle. "And you used it against him?" "Yes," she breathed. "But I want you to know it cost me something. I spent 12 long years being that invisible. I had just started hoping maybe it didn't have to be permanent." Ethan held her gaze with a look so naked it physically ached to witness. "It doesn't have to be permanent," he told her softly. Then Vincent returned, lingering in the doorway. For a brief second, Emma saw the tragic, exhausted father hiding beneath the ruthless patriarch. The lesson we find here is profound. Our deepest scars do not have to become our permanent identity. Vincent walked slowly to his chair and sat heavily. "It is being handled," he stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Emma did not ask how. She understood perfectly well that there were dark corners of this criminal world she had agreed to step into, and bloody corners she wanted no part of. The fate of Dom Ferraro firmly belonged in the dark. "And Caruso?" Ethan asked, pushing the line. Vincent shot his son a sharp look. "Caruso is a separate conversation for a separate day, one we will have together with full information. No more unilateral moves. The heavy pause between them carried 22 years of a fractured, bleeding relationship. "Agreed," Ethan finally said. "It teaches us that setting boundaries is the only way to survive the people who claim to love us the most." Think about the people in your own life, you and I, and how a crisis can rewrite your history. Something invisible shifted between father and son right then. A silent renegotiation. Their dynamic, battered over 3 decades, had been rebuilt in just 4 days, stronger at the broken places the way shattered things often are. Vincent then turned his piercing gaze to Emma. He started to speak, then stopped. This was a man who had spent his entire ruthless life knowing exactly what to say to bend the world to his will, yet he found himself entirely stripped of words. "I do not have adequate language," he finally whispered. "For what you did this week, every choice, from the alley forward. The lesson is beautiful. True gratitude rarely finds the perfect words. It simply exists in the silence." Emma opened her mouth to brush it off, but Vincent raised a hand. "Do not say it was nothing," he pleaded quietly. "Please, let me say this." She closed her mouth and listened. "You walked into a nightmare that had absolutely nothing to do with you, and you made every right decision under unimaginable pressure. You protected my son with a desperate lie in an alley. You told me the ugly truth in my own home. You sat across from a predator today and played a deadly game, armed with nothing but 48 hours of preparation and the specific grace of someone who has been underestimated her entire life. It leaves us with a vital truth to carry forward. Never mistake a person's quietness for weakness, because the most overlooked people often possess the deadliest kind of strength." His voice was impossibly quiet, drained of his usual command, and absolutely sincere. "I am in your debt. That is not a thing I say lightly. It is simply true." Emma sat with the heavy weight of those words. In a flash, her mind dragged her back to being 16 years old, wearing a grease-stained diner apron while watching her sick mother fade away. She thought of the 12 years she spent constantly running, always in motion, just so she would not have to stop and feel how terrifyingly small her world had become. "I want one thing," she said firmly. Vincent held her gaze without blinking. "Name it. When this is over, whatever comes next, I want to know is actually over." Life teaches us this painful reality. Living in a state of constant survival is not actually living at all. "I want you to tell me yourself, directly, when it is finally done," Emma insisted, her voice trembling just a fraction. "I refuse to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if that silver car is waiting for me in the dark." Vincent gave his word instantly. No cold calculation, no mob boss hesitation, just the solemn promise of a man who understood that some moral currencies are worth far more than dirty money. Emma nodded slowly. She gathered her bag and stood up, her eyes drifting over to Ethan. He was looking at her with that profoundly unguarded expression she had first seen over a quiet plate of pasta. "Thursday next week," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with unsaid things. "The lesson we uncover here is quiet but true. Real safety is found in the promises we keep. You and I know how rare it is to find a moment of peace after a storm." "What?" Emma asked softly. "I thought I would come to the diner for coffee," Ethan replied. That careful, genuine smile returned to his bruised face. Emma looked at this man who had been bleeding out in an alley just days ago, a man whose violent world was a million miles from her own. She thought about broken dreams, lost architects, and dangerous shortcuts that lead to unexpected destinations. "Thursday," she agreed softly. "I will save you a seat." She walked out into the cool night air. The black car was waiting. The massive city was already moving on, beautifully indifferent, humming with a million parallel lives. The final lesson is this: no matter how violently your world shatters. Tomorrow will still offer you a place to sit. Picture this. You and I have been there, watching the world blur past a car window, feeling totally unmoored. Emma sat in the back of that cab, watching her old life slide into view. There was her street, her tired brick building. That cracked front step she had been meaning to report for 3 long months, and then the bodega where Tony always knew her order. Every single brick, every shadow, was exactly the way she had left it. But the woman looking out the glass, she was a stranger. She had no idea who she was supposed to be anymore, and for the first time she realized something. Being uncertain is not the same thing as being lost. Sometimes standing in the thickest fog just means you have finally arrived at the real starting line. The terrible, beautiful truth about not knowing is that your soul is just expanding faster than your mind can find the words for it. Emma stepped out onto the pavement. She climbed those familiar stairs, turned the key in the lock, and let the heavy door shut out the world. Thursday evening hung in the apartment, thick and silent. She hung her coat on the peg. She set the coffee maker to brew. Then she slumped into the chair at her small kitchen table, slowly turning her hands over to stare at her empty palms. These were the exact same hands that, just days ago, were smeared with crimson, the hands that pressed desperately against a stranger's fading pulse, the ones that held a golden business card and clamped down hard on a torn artery while a cold voice on the phone warned her not to move. But she refused to run. She dropped to her knees in that suffocating alley, dialed the numbers, and held the line. She looked a terrifying man, named Vincent Sullivan, dead in the eyes, and refused to blink. She walked straight into the jaws of absolute chaos and came out unbroken. At 32 years old, Emma Turner realized she was built for something heavier than pouring diner coffee. The machine sputtered to a stop. She poured her cup, letting the heat warm her fingers. She sat there in a quiet that would never feel ordinary again. The lesson here is simple. When Emma reached into the dark to save a dying man, she found her own courage waiting there. Sometimes, pulling someone else from the edge is the only way we manage to save ourselves.
I would say this story has a strong cinematic opening, a suspenseful emotional structure, and a meaningful educational message about compassion, courage, and the unexpected consequences of doing the right thing. The story begins when Emma Turner, a waitress walking home after a late shift, finds Ethan Sullivan bleeding in an alley. She has a rule not to stop for strangers in dangerous places, but this time she breaks that rule because she sees a human being who may die without help. From that first choice, her quiet life changes completely. Beneath the Mafia suspense, the story is really about conscience, responsibility, trust, and the power of ordinary people in extraordinary situations. The first lesson from the story is that kindness often begins with a risk. Emma is not careless. She understands danger. She knows that stopping in an alley at night can put her in harm's way, but she also understands that fear cannot be the only principle guiding a human life. When she checks Ethan's pulse, she chooses humanity over self-protection. This is a powerful educational message. We should not act recklessly, but we also should not train ourselves to walk past suffering so often that compassion dies inside us. Real courage is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to act responsibly even while afraid. The second lesson is that ordinary people can show extraordinary composure. Emma is not a trained agent, a criminal strategist, or a person from Ethan Sullivan's dangerous world. She is a waitress who has spent years dealing with difficult customers, financial pressure, and a hard life. Yet when the crisis begins, she stays calm. She listens, assesses, and makes decisions quickly. This shows that strength can be built through everyday hardship. The patience and emotional control Emma learned in a diner become survival skills in a life or death situation. That is an excellent message for viewers. Never underestimate the quiet discipline built by ordinary work. The third lesson is about the moral weight of truth and silence. When Vincent Sullivan asks what Ethan said after waking, Emma chooses not to reveal everything. She protects Ethan's secret because she understands that his words could create danger before he is ready to face it. Later, Ethan encourages her to tell the truth. This creates an important educational conflict. When should we keep someone's confidence? And when does truth become necessary? The story does not present an easy answer. Instead, it shows that truth should be handled with care. Silence can protect, but it can also become dangerous if it allows betrayal to grow. The fourth lesson is that helping someone can pull us into responsibilities we never expected. Emma calls the emergency number because she wants to save a life. She does not want money, power, or involvement. But by doing the right thing, she becomes connected to a dangerous conflict inside the Sullivan family. This reflects a real-world truth. Good actions can have complicated consequences. However, that does not make the good action wrong. It means courage often requires continuing to make wise choices after the first brave choice has been made. The fifth lesson is about trust. Vincent Sullivan is powerful, controlled, and intimidating. Ethan is wounded, guarded, and suspicious of his own world. Emma enters their lives as an outsider, but precisely because she is an outsider, she sees things clearly. Ethan trusts her with the truth he cannot easily give his father. Vincent begins to trust her because she does not try to exploit what she knows. This is an important lesson. Trust is not built by status, wealth, or fear. Trust is built by consistency, honesty, and the ability to act with integrity when no one can force you to. Another strong lesson is that being underestimated can become a form of power. Emma is just a waitress in the eyes of many people. That social invisibility becomes her advantage. People speak around her, overlook her, and misjudge her. But Emma is observant. She notices cars, posture, timing, tone, and details others might miss. Her years of service work have trained her to read people quickly. This is a meaningful educational point. Jobs that society undervalues often require deep emotional intelligence. Waitresses, caregivers, cleaners, drivers, nurses, and service workers read human behavior every day. That skill has real value. The story also teaches that family loyalty can become complicated when fear replaces communication. Ethan suspects someone inside the family is betraying them, but he does not tell Vincent for months because he has no proof and fears being wrong. This silence nearly costs him his life. Vincent, in turn, must face the painful truth that power and loyalty do not guarantee honesty. In families, businesses, and communities, trust cannot survive on hierarchy alone. People need safe ways to speak difficult truths before silence turns into crisis. From a YouTube content perspective, this story has many strong elements. The opening is immediate and gripping. A woman finds a dying man in an alley and calls a mysterious emergency number. This creates instant suspense. The audience wants to know who Ethan is, who Vincent is, why the police cannot be called, and why Emma's life is now in danger. The story also uses strong contrasts: diner life versus criminal power, ordinary kindness versus organized violence, silence versus truth, and fear versus moral courage. These contrasts are excellent for audience retention. However, if the story is presented as educational YouTube commentary, the narrator should avoid focusing only on the mafia danger or romantic tension. The deeper message is Emma's transformation from a woman who believes she is small and safe to someone who realizes her choices matter. The strongest angle is not, a waitress enters a dangerous family, but an ordinary woman's compassion exposes betrayal and changes powerful people. Emma is the emotional center of the story because she does not seek power, but she earns respect. She does not try to become important, but her integrity makes her important. She does not enter the alley looking for a new life, but her decision reveals the kind of person she has always been. This is very meaningful for viewers who may feel invisible in their own lives. The story says, your courage, attention, and honesty can matter more than you know. Ethan is also compelling because he represents the burden of carrying suspicion alone. His mistake is not that he is weak. It is that he tries to handle danger without trusting anyone. Vincent's journey is about learning that authority does not mean knowing everything. Even a powerful father can fail to see what his son is carrying. That makes their relationship emotionally strong and educational. In conclusion, This story teaches that one compassionate decision can change the direction of many lives. Emma's decision to stop in the alley saves Ethan, but it also reveals betrayal, forces honesty, and brings hidden conflicts into the open. The lesson is not that people should throw themselves into danger without thinking. The lesson is that courage requires both heart and judgment. The strongest educational message from this story is this: do not underestimate ordinary people, and do not ignore small acts of courage. A waitress with no power, no wealth, and no protection can still change the course of a powerful family because she pays attention, tells the truth, and refuses to let fear control her face. Real strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is a woman kneeling in an alley, pressing her hand against a stranger's wound, and choosing to do the right thing even when she knows her life will never be quiet again.